Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Open to Export webinar, giving an introduction to export controls and licenses. My name is William Barnes-Graham, and I am the Senior Content Editor at the Institute of Export and International Trade. Open to Export is a free online service helping small businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, our Export Action Plan tool, and our quarterly competitions. You can find out about all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's professional membership body for traders. Endorsed by the World Trade Organization and the International Chamber of Commerce as a small business champion, we offer a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious program of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A later in the session, and you can ask questions at any point using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. We've already been sent loads of questions ahead of today's webinar, so we cannot guarantee we'll get through everything we receive. The general principle we will adopt is that we'll ask questions that are relevant to the broader audience, so we won't be able to go into company specifics as such, but if you do have specific questions, we can refer you to our technical helpline afterwards. You can also download a PDF of the slides at any point via the handout drop-down on your control panel, and you'll also be able to watch a recording of this webinar on opentoexport.com/webinars within a day of it finishing. For now, though, it is my pleasure to welcome a great panel of speakers, including Claire Harrison and Matthew Allen from the Department for International Trade's Export Control Joint Unit. And to kick us off, we have Roger Arfi, the Chair of the Institute's Export Control Profession. Over to you, Roger.
Well, thank you very much, Will. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you this afternoon and to be speaking alongside Claire and Matt. I'm looking forward to sharing some of the information we know with you, and hopefully in the questions and answers session, you, the audience, might well be able to share some of your knowledge and experience with us as well. If you'd like to go on to the next slide, then, Will, thank you. So just to run through the agenda for this afternoon, we've had an introduction to the webinar. Thank you, Will, for that. What I'll be doing is talking briefly about the export control profession. Then Claire and Matt will be looking specifically at the UK export controls and licenses. I'll then talk about other export control regimes, because we know that many organisations are not just subject to UK regulations, but also those of other countries, and therefore the complexity of the situation we're in and the importance of professional understanding of what's going on. We're going to talk then briefly about updates to the control lists. I'll cover that when we get to it, and also a subject of interest and discussion is the UK's transition period following Brexit. We'll then talk briefly about sanctions, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. So as we go through, again, as Will has suggested, please do put questions to the panel through the online tool. I'd also like to invite you to make comments about the webinar. I'm sure Will ask that at the end. But also, if you've got any subjects that you would like to hear about in future webinars, then do let us know, because then we can tailor what we're offering to the needs of the industry and the audience. So just to talk briefly about the export control profession. Next slide, please, Will. Thank you. The export control profession is the only professional body in the UK, especially for export control personnel. We launched in May last year, and we've already got over 75 members, and we have a number of people whose applications are in process. It's very exciting because there's not been an opportunity for export control professionals to be part of an organisation before, and we're very grateful to the IOE, Institute of Export, for taking us under their wing. A word for overseas attendees. I noticed in the list of people who are attending this webinar, there's a number of people from overseas. Clearly, if there is an organisation in your own country for export control professionals, we would encourage you to join that. If you are not aware of one or you can't find one, then we're very happy for you to join our export control profession. However, I will say that what we can offer to people overseas is probably not as comprehensive and immediate as what we can offer people in the UK. But this is an offering that we'll be pleased to develop as time goes on. We're created and led by export control specialists. Those of you who know me will know that I used to be the head of export control at Rolls-Royce PLC. And if you have a chance to look at the Export Control Profession Board on the Export Control Profession website, you'll see that we have a prestigious board steering our organisation with representatives from the regulators, from manufacturing companies, from shipping companies, from academia, and from trade associations. So a wide footprint of people there. Our objective is to facilitate compliance with export control and sanctions regulations by promoting professional development and professional recognition of export control staff. Professional development is supported by providing and supporting training and development opportunities, and those are also on our website. And professional recognition is through post-nominal letters, member of the Institute of Export Control Profession or associate member of the Export Control Profession. And we provide other resources to enable increased compliance and, if you like, to recognise the broad family membership of export control professions. A few examples: we issue blogs. There's been a recent one on cloud computing, which is important for anybody who is using cloud computing or is considering using cloud computing. Do read that if you get a chance. We have a quarterly export control magazine. Last one came out in December. Next one will be coming out in March. And other opportunities as well for you to join into the export control community. Thank you, Will. So what I'd like to do now is to pass over to Claire and Matt for a description of the UK export control regulations. And I'll join you in a few moments when they're finished.
Thanks for that, Roger. As we have a very good mix of companies on the webinar, many of you are new to strategic export controls, while others are experienced. Let's start with what the controls are all about. Strategic controls are in place to prevent exports that could contravene the UK global sanctions obligations, could lead to destabilising build-up of conventional weapons or the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Here on in, I'll refer to that as WMD because it's quite a mouthful. Exports that could be diverted from their original intended use, or exports that could be used for abuse of human rights. The controls are wide-ranging and are enshrined in the legislation that Matt will outline later. They include items if they have been designed or modified for use in military applications. Controls apply to actual export or trade of these items. What's trade, you might ask? Supply chain operations mean that you may instruct a sister or parent company overseas to fulfill a military order in a third country. This will require you to apply for a trade control license. Dual use items, those items which can be used for both civil and military purposes. The term also includes all goods which have non-explosive uses or assist in any way with the manufacture of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. Again, there is a broken control on these goods if they are being used for a potential WMD end use, for instance, nuclear or radioactive materials and the plant to process them, chemical or biological reagents for chemical warfare and the plant to produce them, or ballistic missiles and their launch systems. But it's not just the items which are controlled, it's the software and the technology too, which are required to enable the item to function. The technology controls include blueprints, drawings, technical manuals, any information necessary for the development, production or use of the end item. Remember, exchange of technology to anyone outside the UK is also controlled, including putting information in an email or on a USB, or even making it accessible in the cloud. Other controlled items are non-military firearms, or items that can be used for torture purposes, where of course there's a presumption of a ban, and radioactive sources which may pose a significant risk if falling into the wrong hands. All these controlled items are listed in the UK Strategic Export Control List, available from the Export Control Joint Unit website. If you don't know if your goods are controlled, use the Control List Classification Advice Service or the Goods Checker tool on gov.uk. There are a number of different types of sanctions applied to countries by, for instance, the United Nations or European Union. This can also mean that you will need a license to export, or in some cases, there will be a ban on exporting. To find out more about the different types of sanctions, I suggest you visit the gov.uk website for current arms embargoes and sanctions. An arms embargo relates to restrictions on trade with any item on the UK military list, which I just talked about. A trade sanction can bring normally non-controlled items into the realm of control. Financial sanctions mean the UK and international banks will not handle bank transfers from individuals on a sanctions list, so you may not get paid. So make sure you check out your end users and also the financial sanctions list, which are all on gov.uk. This is particularly important because of the end use controls. If you suspect or have been informed that your items will be used for military or WMD end use purposes, you must apply for a license. These items will not necessarily be controlled in the first place. The concern is that they are being sourced for WMD end use. Well, I've covered a fair amount of detail here, and in a moment, I'll be covering all the different licenses which are required for strategically controlled export. But for now, let's hear from Matt about the legislation which sits behind all of this.
Thanks, Claire. So on legislation, I'm now going to give an overview of the legislation which provides the exports, the controls that we have on exports.
Next slide, please, Will.
Before I begin, though, I want to quickly flag that I'll be talking through the implications of the UK having left the EU and us now being in a transition period a little bit later on in the presentation. The important thing is that all of the legislation I'll be talking about on this slide is currently in force and is the basis for how the control of strategic exports works. I'm going to start by talking through the EU dual use regulation. And as Claire mentioned, dual use items are items which can be used for both civil and military purposes. EU dual use regulation provides the legislative basis for how we control the export of these items. But now the key point is that the dual use regulation establishes that a license is required to export all dual use items to countries outside the EU. But it also means that most dual use items do not need a license if they're exported to the EU. The only exception to this are dual use items that are listed in Annex 4 of the EU dual use list. These are dual use items of particular sensitivity and include things such as stealth technology and cryptography. And so these items always require an export license, regardless of the destination they're being exported to. It's a similar story for the export of goods which could be used for torture or capital punishment or other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. These goods are controlled under an EU regulation, and the regulation divides the items it controls into three categories. The first, goods which have no practical use other than capital punishment or torture. These include things such as guillotines and gallows, and all exports of these are prohibited. The second category is goods which could be used for capital punishment, etc., but also have legitimate purposes. These include things like certain pepper sprays and require a license to be exported unless the goods are remaining in the EU. The third category is goods that could be used for capital punishment or torture, but also have legitimate medical applications. Again, these require a license unless they're remaining within the EU. The final piece of EU legislation I'm going to touch on very briefly is the legislation surrounding firearms. The EU Firearms Directive and the EU Firearms Regulation apply in the UK, and broadly what these pieces of legislation mean is that a license is required to export firearms from the UK. This is unless you hold a European firearms pass, which allows individuals to take personal firearms to EU countries without an export license. So those are the main EU pieces of legislation which provide for export controls. I'm now going to talk about the main pieces of UK legislation which provide for export controls. These are the Export Control Act of 2002 and the Export Control Order of 2008, which has been amended since that date a number of times. These pieces of legislation are available to read online at legislation.gov.uk, and they set out how the rules around export controls operate, what items and activities are controlled, what exceptions apply, and how export licenses operate, including provisions around record keeping, registration, and inspection. The Export Control Order 2008 also includes a number of schedules which set out specifically which goods are subject to controls and the countries or destinations which are subject to stricter export or trade controls. So it's a particularly important piece of legislation to keep in mind. I know that one area which is often a particular concern for exporters is the rules around transfers of technology, as Claire touched on earlier. The Export Control Law 2008 includes controls on the transfer of technology. And it's important to remember, as Claire mentioned, that export controls include transfers which are intangible. It isn't just physical goods which are captured. At the moment, we're in the process of updating our online guidance on the technology transfers, which explains the controls in a bit more detail. As soon as this guidance is ready, it'll be uploaded onto gov.uk, so you can expect to see it online in due course. The final piece of legislation I wanted to quickly touch on is the Export of Radioactive Sources Control Order from 2006. This is an order which controls the export of certain high-activity radioactive sources which are listed in the order. They include sources such as promethium, and in a nutshell, this order means that it's prohibited to export these radioactive sources unless you have a license. So exporting any of those goods, do apply for a license. So that ends the kind of whistle-stop tour of the legislation which underpins our export controls. The main takeaway is there are a number of different pieces of legislation, and it's important to engage with them to understand what they mean.
Next slide, please. Thank you. So Claire again here. I spoke earlier about the controls. Now we're going to have a look at the licenses require. Just to say, there is no charge for any of these licenses. If you are exporting or trading or brokering, there are two types of individual licenses, standard and open. The standard individual licenses are used for a shipment or contract where there is a specified end user. These licenses are valid for a period of up to 2 years, require an end user undertaking on the use of the items from the ultimate end user or consignee, and they can be used for up to 100 goods lines. The open individual licenses are used for ongoing contracts with multiple end users. They are valid for a period of up to 5 years, require a simple business case, and also require end user undertakings. There are also over 50 open general export licenses for military and dual use items in which can be used for permitted control list entries and end destinations. You can use them provided you can meet other terms and conditions which are specified in the licenses. These type of licenses involve a one-off registration for use. They include initial exports and activities not related to the initial export. For instance, exporting a controlled item after repair. If you're trading in sanctioned destinations and are supplying financial services or providing technical assistance for a project, you will need to apply for an appropriate license. Talk to the Export Control Joint Unit to find out more about these and how to apply. Transshipment licences are only required when controlled goods are transshipping the UK and a licence is not in place for the end user destination. If you want to find out more on the controls or licences, use the Export Control Training course, Export Control Joint Unit training courses, which will all be eligible for continuous professional development points under the export control profession. Next slide, please. The UK licence system is electronic. It's called Spire. You register as a user and make all applications using your account, including for transfers of technology. Licences will be assessed for risk against a set of 8 criteria. You can also use Spire to ask us to check out your end user and to determine whether your goods are on a control list. That's called the Control List Classification Service. If you need to find out more about using Spire, please sign up for the Export Control Joint Unit licence course. You must declare to Customs if a licence is required and show the issued licences if the standard licences apply, except for transfers of technology. For open licences, commercial documentation must clearly state the licence being used. Next slide, please. Compliance and due diligence is your responsibility. Chief is the Customs digital system for tracking all exports that leave the UK. It is programmed to flag when an export licence is required, and it is also linked to Spire, the electronic licensing database. If a licence is in place and there are no other concerns, the shipment will be green routed. If not, the goods will be stopped. For open licences, trade licences and transfers of technology, these are not declared to Customs. You will receive a visit from the Export Control Joint Unit compliance inspectors. To find out more about these visits, read the guide on compliance visits on gov.uk. There are a range of penalties applied by Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs and Crown Prosecution Service for non-compliance. These range from goods confiscations, financial penalties, and civil penalties with a maximum jail sentence of 10 years. Don't let this happen to you. Find out about exporting compliantly with the profession. Next slide, please. Over to you, Roger.
Thank you, Claire. Well, thank you, Claire and Matt, for that whistle-stop tour of the UK regulations. What I want to talk about now is that how to turn that information into something that your organisation can use to ensure compliance. I think, if you like, the starting point is to find out what it is your organisation is exporting. In a way that might sound obvious, but in fact, when you delve into some situations, you might find that there are exports going on that you don't know about. And it's important for you as export control professionals to find out all of the exports that are being made. Of course, you only actually have to worry about export control if any of those are strategic goods that fall into any of the categories that we've just been hearing about. But just to remind you, a point that Claire emphasised, that you need to know what the items are, whether they're goods, software or technology, what the format of those things are, and what their destinations are, and the routes that they go by. And that's if it's physical export, the physical routes that the items are going by. But if it's software or technology, then it might be the electronic routes by which they are being exported. Now, we've looked at the UK regulations in a high level of detail. many organisations, particularly international organisations, are subject not just to the UK regulations, but other regulations as well. While we're part of the EU, the UK regulations are aligned with the EU regulations in many places, but not all. We'll hear a bit more about what the future might hold. But if you've got an organisation that is handling goods or technology or software from other countries, then you must be aware of whether those countries have any jurisdiction on the exports that you're making. I've mentioned here the UK, Europe, US and others, and many professionals will know that the US regulations are extraterritorial and require quite a lot of attention and understanding in order to comply with them. Understanding of all exporting methods. Again, we've talked here about whether we talk about shipping. Many people forget about exports that are made by hand carrying items. Electronic communications are important, as we've heard, but also if you're allowing access to your server in your country or another country, if that access is from a third country, then that is can be regarded an export and will need an export license if it's strategic technology. One thing that I would like to highlight, and is again sometimes forgotten, is that there are complex regulations about carrying hand carrying electronic equipment, laptops and the like, if that electronic equipment contains certain levels of encryption. Now, many laptops these days do contain encryption systems to protect your company's data that are subject to US or UK encryption export controls, and so an understanding of those regulations is pretty important as well. Otherwise, you might find that your employee is stopped at a border and their laptop removed from them. So do watch out for that one. There's an important point down here as well about ex-works. There has been in the past a belief, I don't know how prevalent it is today, that if you're on ex-works terms, then you as the exporter are no longer responsible for export control and getting the licenses. That is not the case. If you, even if you're under ex-works, you as the exporter have responsibility for obtaining and complying with the licenses. And this gives me an opportunity to plug an article that will be appearing in the Export Control magazine. Alex Turner of Customs Connect has published in the past a series of 10 common mistakes for exporters, which we are serializing in Export Control magazine, and this is one of her 10 common mistakes. So it will be appearing in the magazine in the near future, looking out for situation of ex-works. Another highlight that I'd like to make is that whereas, as Claire has indicated, the UK regulations really revolve around whether when an item, whatever it is exported or made accessible in another country. If you're dealing with US export controlled items, then you also have to think about deemed exports, and this is where an export is deemed to have been exported, an item is deemed to be exported to another country if it is given to or accessed by a national of that country. Now, the regulations are quite complex, but it could well be that if you've got a non-UK citizen working in your team and your US export license allows the data to come or the goods to come from the US to the UK, then allowing access to that by somebody who's not a UK citizen could be a deemed export and also require licensing. There's a lot of detail behind that that would need understanding and analysis. So you can see that there's a lot to be done by an export control person. They've got to have eyes and ears everywhere, and they've got to have a very detailed knowledge of all the exports and the movement of goods and technology and software around their organization, as well as a good understanding of all the relevant export control regulations. So the export control professional needs regular training, but of course they can't have eyes and ears throughout their organization, and so it's important that all the people in your organization who are capable of making an export are aware of the export control regulations at a level that is suitable for their role. And so it's important to consider what training you need to give everybody in your organization in order to avoid them making inadvertent illegal exports. And this is another role for an export control manager, export control professional, is working out what communications they need to receive and making sure that those communications are delivered and understood. So to cover all these situations, it's quite a good idea to have an internal compliance program. Now, again, there's lots of guidance around on internal compliance programs, which cover all the sorts of things that we've been talking about today, and it's a good idea for your organization to have one. There is no regulatory requirement for you to have one, but we thoroughly recommend it. And if you want to know more about internal compliance programs, then by all means do contact us and help. We'll help you in the development of that. I'd like to move on to the next slide then, William, because I'm changing subject slightly here. And that is one of the things I wanted to highlight, is that the control lists are updated regularly. Unfortunately for us export control professionals, export control is not static. There is always changes happening, and one of the things that export control professionals need to do is to keep track of the changes. Now, the UK and EU control lists are updated approximately every 6 months to reflect changes to UK and EU regulations. And sometimes those changes drive changes in open licenses as well. So it's very important that we keep track of the changes that are taking place. The latest update was January this year. And it was well signposted in notices to exporters, and the control lists have been changed, and there's been notices to say that some of the open licenses have changed for self-consistency as well. So an important job is to keep an eye on the changes to see if and how your organization is affected. I thought I'd just give you a bit of an example at the moment. We published the changes in Export Control magazine, and I happen to have it open in front of me here. I'm not going to go through the whole lot because there's a lot of detail, but just to give you an idea of what I would have done in this situation, there's one of the changes, and I'll read it to you. It says, deletion of entry for technology for diffusion bonding for gas turbine engine components, 9E003A7. Now, I know that Rolls-Royce uses diffusion bonding for gas turbine engine components, and I'm pretty sure that in exchanging that information between the different teams in Rolls-Royce, we would have exported that technology, and therefore we would have an export control license to allow that exchange. The deletion of that entry means that we no longer need those licenses. Now, I wouldn't pretend to know all the places we use diffusion bonding for the components, nor all the places where we would be exchanging and exporting that technology. So what I would do in that situation is to get in touch with the people involved in diffusion bonding, whether those are the scientists who develop the technology, or the engineers who design components that use that technology, or the procurement people who are sending out specifications to suppliers and potential suppliers for technology, for goods that are, for manufacture of goods that are going to be made using that technology, and find out where all that technology is being exported, find out what export licenses it's being exported under, and then reconfiguring everything so that we no longer we can stop using those licenses because it's no longer required. So that's the sort of job that you would do when the licenses come out. Sorry, when the changes to the control list come out. There are about 20 changes on here. I don't know which ones would apply to any given organisation, but that's the job to do. Just to let you know, it's not just the UK and EU list that change regularly. The US regulations are changing frequently as well. Those are all flagged on the websites of the DDTC in the Department of State for the ITAR and the BIS website of the Department of Commerce for the EAR regulations. So again, keeping track of all those changes is an important part of our job. Next slide, please. So just thought we'd like to move on to transition, and perhaps I can pass this on to Claire and Matt.
Absolutely, thanks, Roger. So just to quickly talk through where we are now. Now that the UK has left the EU, we're now in this transition period. The transition period will be up until 11 o'clock on the 31st of December this year. And the first thing I want to highlight is that we in the Export Control Joint Unit sent out a notice to exporters about export control during the transition period. It was published on the 29th of January and can be accessed online on gov.uk. If you search notice to exporters, you should be able to find it easily. I'd really encourage you to read it in full because it contains the most complete and up-to-date set of information about the transition period. And it also has helpful to all the guidance that's also as up-to-date as it can be. It's only a short notice as well, so you go along from reading it. There are a few key points that I wanted to share about the transition period though. The first is that the current export licensing arrangements continue to apply until the end of the transition period on the 31st of December. All the legislation I spoke about earlier continues to remain in force and is live at the moment. That means that licensing carries on as previously for all of the items that we control. You remember that we published an open general export license last year, specifically to cover the export of dual-use items from the UK to the EU. During the transition period, this license is not required. As I mentioned earlier, no license is required to move dual-use items between the UK and the EU, except for those items on Annex 4. Additionally, during the transition period, no licenses are required to move goods which could be used for torture or capital punishment between the UK and the EU. And military goods require a license regardless of the destination, as was the case previously. As for the arrangements for after the transition period ends, these are dependent on the nature of the relationship that is agreed with the EU. We'll communicate any necessary actions that you may need to take as soon as possible. And this takes me to the last key point that I wanted to make in relation to the end of the transition period. And that's to encourage you to sign up for the notices to exporters on gov.uk. That way you'll receive an email alerts with the key information that you need. And also to sign up for the Business Readiness Bulletin that is run by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. One final plug from me on transition period and preparedness is that the Export Control Joint Unit run a series of seminars and briefings. So if you feel like you want to improve your knowledge of export controls or aid your preparedness in advance of the end of the transition period, we're happy to run such events for you as and when we're able to share more information about arrangements for after the transition period.
Next slide, please.
So now I'd like to hand to Roger.
Sorry, Matt. Are you handing back to me, Matt? I crashed you there.
No worries, Roger. Yeah, handing back over to you for a final second.
Thank you very much. Right, I just wanted to, before we finish and go into the questions and answers, just talk a little bit more about sanctions. Claire mentioned them earlier on in the session. There's a couple of things I wanted to highlight for those who are who get involved in sanctions. many export control professionals do get involved in sanctions, and again, it can be quite a complicated area. And so I think it was worthwhile just touching on it, really. A lot of what I've written down here, measures include arms embargoes and other trade control restrictions. These are things that Claire has already mentioned in the context of the UK. And UK guidance, as she said, is on the gov.uk website. And as Matt has just indicated, EU sanctions will continue to apply in the UK until the end of the year. But as I sort of implied in the previous section, other countries also have their own sanctions regimes. And if you handle items under their jurisdictions, then you need to comply with those regulations as well. Couple of points I'd just like to make down here. One is that those lists are changing a lot, frequently. In fact, if you follow Gary Stanley's or any other daily blogs, you'll see that the US regulations are changing the denied parties lists apparently daily. And just keeping track of your exports to those sorts of, whether they're caught by those regulations, can be quite difficult. There are a number of organizations that provide denied parties lists and denied parties screening. So you can sign up to those, and they undertake to keep the list up to date, so that you can do a daily check of what you're exporting and where you're exporting to, or if you're doing very specific activities with certain countries, then you can do special checks for denied parties lists in those organizations as well. So there are a number of tools out there that can be accessed either directly, or if you're a small organization, you might be able to tap into them by having some sort of contract with an organization that can use them for you. The other thing I just wanted to mention briefly is that there's quite a lot of discussion going on at the moment about conflicts of sanctions regulations. With the, I'm going to have to be careful what wording I use. So, but with the removal of some of the US content involvement in the JCPOA with Iran, then they have introduced some additional sanctions on American items being exported to Iran. But it could well be that those items are embedded in European items that are being exported to Iran legitimately. And so there are some cases in point where the US sanctions, the EU have brought in a blocking sanction, which means that to comply with the US sanction is illegal in the EU. And so organizations are faced with the decision of whether to comply with, or whether not to comply with the US regulations or not to comply with the EU regulations. And there have been some court cases on that. I was talking about this to some people last week, and they said this is not a new phenomenon. They've come across the same sort of thing when they're moving items from countries like Russia, where again there might be conflicts of sanctions. If you find yourself in that situation, well, first of all, look out for that situation, because you don't want to be caught in it if you can avoid it. But if you do get caught in it, then I advise that you contact your legal department or a lawyer to help you through that very difficult situation. But I'm just flagging it as something you might want to keep an eye open for. So that's the thrust of what we're talking about. Just to go through the sorts of things we've talked about over this webinar. I gave an introduction to the export control profession. Claire and Matt talked about UK export controls and licenses. We looked at other export control regimes and the importance for export control professionals to have a professional understanding of not just the regulations, but of also also the exports that are made from their organisation. We've looked at the way the control lists are kept up to date, and therefore are updated frequently, so it's important that you keep up to date with those lists. We've touched on the transition period. Look out for change